The Spurs are not a future team anymore. They are a problem right now. That is the truth people are late to admit. For too long, San Antonio got talked about like a young squad that still needed time, still needed patience, still needed years. Not anymore. This team is already winning, already pushing serious teams, and already starting to look like something the West did not want to deal with this soon. What makes this hit harder is how real it looks. This is not one player saving the night. This is not some lucky streak that will fade in a week. The Spurs look sharp, fast, and under control. They defend with purpose, they move like they trust each other, and they play with the kind of belief that changes how people see a team. That is when a rebuild stops being a nice story and starts becoming bad news for everybody else. And that is why this rise gets your attention fast. A jump like this does not happen by accident. Teams do not go from being ignored to being taken seriously without something bigger happening behind the scenes. The Spurs may look dangerous now, but the real story starts before these wins, back when this franchise was drifting, losing its shape, and looking nothing like the team people used to fear. There was a time when San Antonio did not feel dangerous at all. It felt finished. The old standard was gone. The old fear was gone. And the team that once looked steady every year started losing its shape. Tim Duncan was done. Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili were gone. Kawhi Leonard was out too. And that ended whatever was left of the old path. What came after that was not a clean new beginning. It was a team stuck in the middle with no real control of where it was going. That middle is where a lot of teams stay trapped. You are not strong enough to matter, but you are not bad enough to fully reset. That is where the Spurs were living. DeMar DeRozan and Jakob Poeltl gave them solid minutes, and Keldon Johnson came in from that deal. But the bigger picture still felt flat. San Antonio was no longer the team people feared in May. It was a team trying to hold itself together while the league kept moving forward. And that is what made the next shift so important. The Spurs could not keep pretending the old way would carry them back. Something had to change inside the team before the wins could ever change on the court. That next part is where this story starts getting serious, because long before the spotlight came back, San Antonio quietly began changing what kind of team it wanted to become. The real change did not begin on draft night. It began earlier when San Antonio finally stopped trying to patch up the old version of the team and started building a different one. In the Orlando bubble, they leaned into younger players, more speed, and a style that made more sense for where the league was going. The ball moved more, the floor opened up more, and the team started looking less like it was protecting the past and more like it was testing a new future. That mattered because this was bigger than changing lineups. It was a shift in mindset. The Spurs started valuing length, flexibility, and players who could do more than one job. They were no longer chasing a quick fix. They were trying to create a group that could grow together and play a more modern game. It wasn't flashy and it didn't get much attention at the time, but this is where the foundation started to take shape. And once that shift was in place, the next step became clear. San Antonio had to stop thinking only about who could help in the moment and start thinking about what each move could become later. That is where this story gets even more interesting, because some of the moves that looked like losses from the outside were actually the moves that gave the Spurs real power going forward. The Spurs did not change this team by holding on to comfort. They changed it by making hard calls most teams are scared to make. DeMar DeRozan was moved in a sign and trade. Derek White was dealt. Then came the move that really started to make people stop and stare, when DeJounte Murray was sent to Atlanta. From the outside, it looked like San Antonio was backing away. Inside the building, they were doing something else. They were collecting picks, clearing space, and giving themselves more than one path forward. That is what made this stretch so important. These were not random trades. Each one gave the Spurs more room to act later. They turned veterans into assets. They added future first-round picks. They kept building flexibility instead of locking themselves into a middle-level team with no real way up. Even when Jakob Poeltl was moved for more draft value, the message stayed the same. San Antonio was not tearing everything down without a plan. It was peeling the roster back piece piece by piece so the next big chance wouldn't pass them by. And that patience is what set up the moment that changed everything. Once the Spurs had enough room, enough picks, and enough control over their future, they were finally in position to strike when the door opened. That next step is where this story turns, because all of that planning was about to meet the one outcome every rebuilding team hopes for, but almost none can count on. Then the moment finally came. After all the losing, all the patience, and all the hard roster moves, the Spurs got the one thing every rebuilding team hopes for and almost none can count on. They won the lottery and landed Victor Wembanyama. That changed everything, but not in the lazy way people talk about it. This was not just about adding a star. This was about a franchise that had spent years making room for a player like this and was ready when that chance finally showed up. What made it different was that the Spurs didn't lose themselves once they got him. They didn't throw a young roster on the floor and hope talent would sort everything out. They kept the team steady, they kept the culture in place. They avoided bad long deals and brought in real veterans instead. Chris Paul gave them control, calm, and smart habits. Harrison Barnes gave them balance, and for a young player like Stephen Castle, that kind of help mattered. His growth didn't happen by accident. It came from being in a setup that actually made sense. That is why this part of the story matters so much. A lot of teams get lucky once and still waste it. San Antonio did not. They gave their biggest piece a real structure to grow in, and that put them in position for something even bigger. Because once Wembanyama was in place and the foundation still held strong, the Spurs were no longer just building for later. They were ready to make the kind of move that changes the speed of everything. San Antonio did not stop after landing their franchise star. That's what separates this team from a normal rebuild. Once Victor Wembanyama was in place, the Spurs did not sit back and wait for the future to arrive on its own. They used what they had built. The draft picks, the flexibility, and the patience finally turned into action when they went after De'Aaron Fox. That move changed the feel of the whole project. Fox gave them speed, pressure on the rim, and another player defenses had to fear. Suddenly, this wasn't just a young team with promise. It was a team starting to look dangerous on purpose. And then came another huge lift. Dylan Harper entered the picture as one more sign that this franchise was moving faster than expected. Now, the Spurs were not just adding talent, they were stacking layers. Fox brought proven firepower, Harper brought fresh upside. Wembanyama was already the center of everything. Add in the young pieces already growing around them, and the picture got a lot more serious. This was no longer about waiting to see what the Spurs might become one day. The shape of the next version was already starting to show. That's why this part of the story feels so important. This is where San Antonio stopped looking patient and started looking bold. But just when it felt like everything was finally lining up, the story took a hard turn. Because right when this team looked ready to hit another level, everything around it started to go wrong at once. Just when it seemed like San Antonio looked ready to push this thing forward, the whole season got hit at once. Greg Popovich was sidelined after a stroke, and that shook everything around the team. Then Victor Wembanyama was ruled out with deep vein thrombosis after the All-Star break. Fox had barely started sharing the floor with him when that happened, and not long after that, Fox chose surgery on the injured finger he had been fighting through all year. For a while, it felt like the Spurs were losing every big piece at the worst possible time. That is what made this stretch so important. This was the kind of moment that can break a young team and drag everything backward. Instead, San Antonio kept moving. Mitch Johnson stepped in during a time that could have easily spun out of control, and the group didn't fall apart under him. The locker room stayed together. The standards stayed in place. Even with all the noise, the Spurs still looked like a team that believed it had something real to protect. And that is where this story takes another turn. Because getting through that kind of stretch does more than test talent. It shows what a team is made of. San Antonio did not come out of that period looking softer or more uncertain. It came out looking tougher, more connected, and more ready for what was next. And once the team got through that storm, the last piece of the story started to show up fast. This was no longer just a talented young group. This was starting to look like a real contender.
Now the picture is clear. San Antonio isn't just a team with young talent anymore. It's a team with shape, balance, and a real identity on both ends of the floor. The offense has more force now, with Fox pushing the pace and putting pressure on the rim. The young guards bring even more drive and energy. The shooters give the floor space. And behind all of that, Wembanyama changes everything near the basket. This is what makes the Spurs hard to deal with now. They can hurt teams in more than one way, and they no longer look easy to rattle. The other big change is on defense. That's where San Antonio started looking like a serious team instead of just an exciting one. The effort is stronger, the coverage is tighter, and the whole group looks more locked in. The coaching staff deserves credit for that jump, because this team now defends with purpose and trust. Guys know where to be. They help each other. They recover fast. And when a team adds that kind of defensive edge to a young core that's already growing on offense, it stops looking like a nice story and starts looking like a problem for the whole conference. That's why the Spurs feel different now. This rebuild is no longer about hope, it's about results. San Antonio went from losing its old identity to building